So the overall theme, uncharted territories, navigating the edge of possibilities. My particular portion is linked to how navigating negative past can be the foundation for a positive future. So if someone had told me as a kid growing up in East London in Hackney that I would go on to own a major record label with Sony as a partner, have several businesses, discover talent who go on to scale the world, I probably would have laughed and said, yeah, mate, all right. Because those options or those possibilities didn't seem like real things for someone coming from an area I came from. Not because I didn't dream big, but because they just weren't visible options. As a black kid born to immigrant parents, growing up in an inner city council estate in the 80s, in one of Britain's poorest boroughs, racism, unemployment, stuff like that was what was around. And so your obvious possibilities were more akin to gangs, drugs, prison, and probably death in reality. And you know, when you grow up with that kind of reality and outlook, obviously it affects how you think, and your thinking can shrink. But easier doesn't always mean better. And I was very fortunate, and my first advantage was my family. I grew up in a very loving family. My parents, as I touched upon, were immigrants from the Caribbean. God was very important. That was first in our house. Both of them worked. And we had a real loving environment. We watched TV together, the soaps, you know, Top of the Pops, all the rest of it. Music, food, and all of that stuff was all stuff that was important, and we did everything together, as I said. But outside my home, chaotic, very dangerous. By the 90s, Hackney had got worse. My high road was dubbed Murder Mile because of a spate of murders that had taken place. And in some instances, I knew the perpetrators and the victims. And this was the reality that I navigated as a teenager. So what I'm going to touch upon now is what I look at as my kind of first make or break period. So I'm 19 years of age, and this is the space that I'm navigating, right? There's a real ongoing gang-related events taking place. And in that time, I'm 19, and two things happen. I'm about to become a father, and my parents are going to retire and migrate back to the Caribbean. So I'm 19 with now a mortgage, a child, and a lot of responsibility. While many of my friends were having a lot of fun, raving, you know, some at college and etc., I had to go to work. But my responsibilities, I believe, actually saved me because they were huge. But they kept me focused in the midst, as I said, of a lot of chaos. I had to grow up very fast. I had a job at British Telecom, and it was outside the area I lived. It was in South London. I lived in East London. So I spent a lot of time outside of the area, which kept me away from moments when things happen that can keep you stuck in. I just wasn't there, so I missed those things. And between my work commitments and my passion for music, it kind of anchored me and kept me away. So I spent most of my days at work trying to not work. They probably won't love me for that. And then in the evenings, I would spend my evenings doing all the things I really wanted to do. I was passionate about music, so I would race home to go to the studio, meet up with my friends. We had been in a group since we were in school. And that was what I really wanted to do. And what happened was we created our own record label because we couldn't get a record deal. No one would sign us. And so we used to sell our CDs on the street. And by chance, I one day sold a CD to a fellow who just happened to be starting a brand new channel, which was called Channel U. It was the beginning of its journey, so they didn't have loads of content. And so in the conversation, it was like, look, if you've got any content, help us out. And I was like, fine, no problem. I know how to do that. I knew plenty of artists just like me who couldn't get onto the major situation, so you had content that you couldn't get out. And this was before the internet, guys. So I rounded up content from all of the artists and creators that I knew, and turned out probably 100 videos, dropped it on the desk, like, all right, what do we want to do now? And they were just absolutely shocked. Pretty much offered me a job on the spot, and I ultimately became the manager of the channel. The channel blew up, became, if you'd like, what I would say was the fundamental identity in what I would call British youth culture now when it relates to music and lifestyle. So for the first time, we were seeing ourselves on the screen as opposed to seeing American culture and American talent. So it's part of the advent of, or the explosion of grime music. So think your Wileys, your Lethal B's, your Dizzy Rascals, right? So I'm the manager of this channel. This channel becomes a growing concern. My phone doesn't stop ringing. I'm feeling very important. It's lovely. And this has all happened just by default of being out there trying to do my own thing. I then enter what I would call a make or break period, because after 3 years, this abruptly ends. I've been pushed out and it abruptly ends. So now I'm trying to find my feet. I learned a valuable lesson in this period though, because when my phone stopped ringing, I realized that I was sitting in a hot seat, but I didn't own the hot seat. So the minute I was no longer there, people would call who was there because they needed access to that. They didn't need access to me. And so I decided that I never wanted the rug to be pulled from under my feet again, and I would build my own business. What I didn't realize back in 2007 was what was around the corner. Credit crunch, recession in 2008, it was a very, very difficult time. It takes a long time to get a business off the ground. I didn't know that, but it takes a long time. And during that time, things were really tough. It was hard to earn money. It was hard to maintain looking after my son as well as managing my bills. And so at that point, it was a bit of a test to do I go back to old habits that are available to me, which would be crime, to earn money while I'm trying to get to where I'm really trying to go. But I chose a different path. A friend of mine was working for Addison Lee, and I decided that I would take his vehicle 3 nights a week and go and earn some money, basically. So I did the night shifts. And I did that just so I had enough money to pay my mortgage, to say, make sure that my son had what he needed. In that time, I carried on looking for talent and building up, my roster, or looking for people to build my roster. I was doing a talk in a youth center in Hackney, and I discovered Labyrinth. So Labyrinth became my first signing. After discovering Labyrinth, that very much gave me my barometer for what I needed to look for. I discovered Naughty Boy. Naughty Boy started to have some success, and he importantly introduced me to Emily Sandé, and he then introduced me to Sam Smith. All of these guys, in a within 2 years of each other, they go on to start having massive success and impacting not just the domestic chart, but the global charts. So it's a big deal. In the midst of that, though, there's that moment where what is on surface success hasn't caught up with what's actually in my bank account yet, right? So going back to the recession and whatnot, I'd built up a bit of debt. So I pretty much was robbing Peter to pay Paul even during that time, and suffered from a bit of imposter syndrome because I was in environments that people had assumptions as to who I was and what I was about. And while I was that, sometimes there are more than one truth. So that was a difficult thing to navigate. Meanwhile, with all of the success that's happening, we've gone from, being a local talent scout to the Mobile Awards to the Brits, now at the Grammys, all within about a 4-year scheme. So, this is where I now found myself in what was uncharted territory. I'm now in rooms that I've never been in before. But each leap, it opened up a new world of possibilities. However, you have some concerns about those things, but given the environments I navigated as a teenager back in East London and Hackney, the music business held no fear for me because there was other things to be fearful of than this. Worst thing that can happen is someone says no one dies. So this was easy. But success brought about other challenges. In particular, I experienced some envy and plenty of isolation. So as Emily Sandé sold 5 million albums and Sam Smith then went on to sell 10 million albums, as I said, I found myself in places where I was surrounded by people who didn't necessarily look like me or come from my background. Meanwhile, my peers who, from my community per se, my success caused issues there. And so I was seen as the guy who was now too commercial. So I didn't quite fit into the world where my success had me, and I was no longer kind of accepted within my immediate peer group. Accept is probably a bit strong. I was, I guess it was a bit intimidating. So if I was trying to sign an artist, they would say to him, don't go to Riki. He doesn't care unless it's the number one, which wasn't entirely true. So anyway, I had to, reset and go back to my core and my roots. And that led to another opportunity. And that opportunity was working with Krypton Conan, who went on to have a top 10 album and a top 10 single with Freak of the Week, which was a massive hit. Although at the start, it came from raw, underground authenticity of hip hop. So that was in a really important time, because what that helped me to do was to show people that you couldn't really put me in a box. Because sometimes, as I say, you can become too successful for your own community to view you as a peer anymore. So your success almost takes you out of, the space where they see you and accept you. And you can also be in a space where your success puts you in areas with people that you, as I say, you're not completely in tune with yet anyway, because you're new to that space. And so what I had to prove, in my view, was to show that as a black man, we are not monolithic. We're not one thing. Multiple things can be true. I can tell you all the things that I've told you about where I grew up and how I grew up in terms of my environment. And I can also tell you how different it was in my actual household. And those things true at the same time. Anyway, we step forward and we continue to march on. So after the success of Krept and Conan, there's a new explosion of youth culture where rap music in the UK is blowing up. I've now been so Sony reached out to myself and my partner Glyn to ask us if we would start a record label. It's the only part of the business that I hadn't done at this point. And I never even imagined that it was possible to own a record label when I first got into the music business, considering that at the beginning I couldn't even get signed as an artist. So in 2017, we started our label called Since 93 Records. We signed an artist called Fredo, Lowski, and H, and we started to have hit records. We then expanded into Africa, working with Wizkid on his Made in Lagos album. We signed Tems and an artist called Tyla, who go on to have great global success. All of these things amount to a time where I'm now in a position where my achievements are, I feel like I'm there now. There's no longer this imposter syndrome. And the brand's getting big enough, and I want to diversify. And being that, my viewpoint is that we can be fearless if we believe in what we're doing. I've always loved sport. Football was actually my first love. And once music took off, I decided to reinvest some of my income into sport and started a football agency. And that was in 2018. And in 2024, we had our first Premiership player. So all of these things I say to show you that each problem that you go through just prepares you for the opportunity on the other side. You just have to hang in long enough to get there and to see it and realize it. Sometimes when I think about my two sons, one who I had so young that he didn't really get to, as a kid, see the benefits of the success per se, because he grew up with me, basically. My wife and I, with our youngest now, he's had 3 holidays this year. He went to private school. My worry is the reverse for him. Is he going to have the resilience to be able to deal with when life gets difficult? Things that I managed to do just like that because I came from difficulty. So managing chaos was normal and regular for me. So, these are the things we now worry about and try to put in place, to try and, put little things in place to make it a little harder for him. So when life does punch him in the face, he gets up, because the punch in the face will come. So I say all of that. What does all of this mean? What this means is you don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be able to see the finish line at the point that you start. You just need the courage to start, to be resilient, to take the next step, even when it feels unsteady or when there's no map. And if I've learned anything, and I've learned a lot, but if there's anything that I would leave you with, it's this. Your story is your power. So don't be ashamed, no matter where you come from or what your beginnings are. You survived it because you're resilient. Having little makes you resourceful. You came through it, you can dare and afford to be fearless. The future is yours. Go ahead and shape it. And, while a head start, as we've touched upon, does come with benefits, it's how you finish that defines you and not how you start. That's what I want to leave you with.